Love that you do that.
All right, dude. We got chapter 6. I love this chapter. I thought it was great. I thought the take-home message was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Number 6, core strength, stability, and mobility. Injury prevention from the inside out. This chapter's full of really good advice, really good information. She starts off with defining the core, and I thought this was a beautiful definition. This is me ad-libbing a little bit, but it's the top of your shoulder to the bottom of your butt cheeks. Mm-hmm. If we cut off your leg where it meets your trunk, cut off your arms where they meet the trunk, and cut off your neck, everything that's left is bottom of the butt cheeks, tops of the shoulders, and that is all your core. A lot of people think that core is your belly, and that's simply not true. So if you train your core and just train your belly, you're missing most of it.
Yeah. When I was in undergrad, I remember specifically reading I don't remember what book it was, but it was something about training periodization. And there was a whole section defining what the core was, and the term they always used was lumbopelvic hip complex, which is way too much of a mouthful to remember. Mm-hmm. So my mentor, Dr. Stone, what he would always say is, it's not the core, it's the midsection, which basically encompasses everything you talked about.
Yeah. So with that definition, is bench press core work? Yes, because it works here. This is part of your core. Pull-ups, core work. But it actually works your abs too, but your lats, huge part of your core if you have back issues. Your glutes, huge part of your core. So if most of your training addresses the core, you're going to do pretty well. And that was kind of her point. Ladies are 3 to 8 times more likely to blow a ligament than a dude is. And the 3 to 8 kind of depends on your sport. I believe high school to collegiate soccer players are at the highest risk of anybody, just statistically. That could have changed at this point. And then she lists some of the reasons and factors that influence that number is ladies' hormones make connective tissue more lax at certain times of your cycle. Ladies have wider hips, which can lead to a more knock-kneed position. It can lead to excessive foot pronation, which also can create some problems. And it's interesting, as you get into your 30s, your hips for a lady get wider. And once you hit 40, they start to get narrower again. So there's kind of like, as you go through puberty and then full womanhood, the hips are going to get bigger. In general, women are smaller than men, so that means all of your tissues are smaller. So your ligaments, your connective tissue, it's smaller. Smaller requires less force to rupture. So you have smaller ACLs, they're easier to blow up. Shoulder joints are less stable. And if you can kind of think about that. So one that clicks home for me is I've got a little baby girl, and I've got this front carrier that goes on, and there's a strap right in between your shoulder blades, which would be slightly higher than a bra line is for a lady. Mm-hmm. And dude, I'm carrying Ren around, and like if she's fussing, I have to find someone in the neighborhood and be like, hey, will you unbutton this for me so I can get her out? And then I get her out, I calm her down, and then I'm like, hey, will you button that back up? So just like shoulder stability. I have bad shoulders. I've blown them both out a couple of times. Some guys can get their hands back there, but most guys cannot. Mm-hmm. So those are just facts that make a lady more susceptible to ligament and tendon injuries, but it's easy to avoid. You have to pay attention to training your core, which again is everything except your head, your arms, and your legs, and just good strength training that addresses the whole body. Mm-hmm. Anything to add on that, like injury risk side of things?
Yeah. I think one thing that Stacy mentions in this chapter, and I've also seen in my career just through athlete monitoring, is that a lot of women are very quad dominant in their movement patterns. So a simple test you might use is like a depth jump. And you can take videos of it, use force plates, just depends what you have access to. But you see a lot of people end up front loading, especially women. Mm-hmm. It's common on both men and women, but women are definitely a little higher percentage there. Yep. So you're putting a lot of anterior force through that ACL area. Mm-hmm. So Stacy recommends train the hips, make them stronger. I think she calls them the steering wheel of the legs, trying to make sure that you can control what angle your femurs, tibia are at, right?
Yeah.
I think an important thing for me too is just overall strength levels, right? Because regardless of if your movement patterns are good, if you're experiencing forces that you can't handle, then sometimes there are bad consequences for that, right?
Correct.
So strength training is super important. And I think we'll get into the rest of that here in a minute.
Yeah. She talks about PEP, which is Prevent Injury, Enhance Performance. A group out of California, I forget the exact group, came up with that, and they've used it at the collegiate level and had really good success in implementing their program, which is just a well-designed strength training program. And the reduction of ACL injuries across a couple of teams that Stacy references in the book. And good strength training really, really, really is injury prevention. Doing like PT movements to make your hips like clamshells, like going to PT to try to prevent injury is scratching the surface, where we might need to do some PT stuff to fix the hips, fix the back, fix the knees, whatever, to get them out of a state of pain. But the way you finish that off and the bulk of injury prevention has to be a well-designed strength program. And what I mean by well-designed is, well, actually, you talk about that because that's your forte.
Yeah. So, in my personal opinion, a well-designed program is periodized in nature, which means you have an idea of what you're looking to develop and you have a timeline to get there. So then you can start choose your methods on how you want to get those qualities built, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really common, especially with people who are just getting into strength training, that they don't really have a goal as far as like, well, this feels like a hard workout, so I'm going to stick with sets of 10 and I'll just do that from here on out, right? So they kind of get the routine and they don't really modify past that. But in my personal opinion, it's really important, especially for women, to focus on strength and then eventually move to exercises that have high rates of force development. Because usually if you're having some sort of, big impactful ligamentous or like joint issue, it happens at speed or under a lot of force.
Yep.
So you can name the sport: soccer, skiing, even running to an extent. And those things don't normally happen when you're doing something pretty slow, pretty easy for you.
Correct.
So if you're not able to develop force quickly and stabilize joints, that's when things happen that are unintended.
Yep. And another part, just to add to that, is you've got to make sure you're hitting all sides of the joint and all sides of the tissue. So if you're just doing squats and lunges and you're not doing posterior chain development, that's not great. If you're just doing posterior chain development and you're not doing any quad development, also not great.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to just move forward and backwards. You don't want to just move side to side. You also need to move rotationally. So there's quite a few different factors, and that's where finding a coach, somebody that understands good program development, that is the best thing you can do, especially if you're a woman, because you do have risk factors just by nature of being a woman that elevate your injury risk. And if you address those risk factors, they become a non-factor, which is cool.
And I think one last thing as far as training programs go, and this is a pet peeve of mine, but please train full range of motion. Train your joint through its entire range of motion so that you can be strong regardless of what position you're in. Correct. I think that is super important, and it's a box that a lot of us miss.
Correct. And that doesn't mean you can't do exercises that are partial range of motion as accessory, but the meat and potatoes of the program needs to be as full range of motion as you can do with good form, pain-free.
Yes.
And that's where mobility comes into play, which let's talk about that now. So women, Stacy brings this up, and I'm so happy she did. Mobility is way more important to train than flexibility. A lot of women are very flexible in nature, and we like to do what we're good at, and that's where you get into kind of a yoga cycle, Pilates cycle. Pilates is closer to mobility training than yoga. So flexibility, this is a quote from the book, so don't hate on me. Flexibility is gathering the qualities of a rubber hose. Looser joints are more at risk. You need tone in the joint capsule for best athletic results. So the difference between mobility and flexibility. Flexibility is if you're standing there and you just do a forward fold with your legs straight, and a lot of flexible women can put their nose on their knees or in that general area, keep their legs straight, pull down. It's like, wow, you're really flexible. The Same movement would be to stand up and now keep your leg straight and pick it all the way up until your knee touches your nose, keeping your leg straight. Almost 0% of people can do that. And so your flexibility is enormous, and then your mobility is, most people start to struggle when they get their leg up to about 90 degrees, maybe a little bit higher. You can also train it seated, where just sit down with your back against the wall, keep your leg straight, and just pick it up. Still, most people can't get above 40, 45 degrees there. So mobility is how much control of your range of motion do you have. If it's close to a 1-to-1, you'd be able to do a forward fold, set it down, and then sit there with your butt on the ground, legs out straight, and bring it up within 5-10 degrees of your face. And that's true around the entire body. So mobility has a strength component. The strength component is much more important for women than the flexibility component.
Correct.
Anything to add on that?
No, I think you hit it on the head there. I mean, basically to me, mobility implies that you have control and proprioception of where you are, which is going to allow you to ultimately utilize that range of motion a whole lot better, whether it's in sport, training, or just in daily lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other part for me, just the way my brain thinks, is that when you have mobility, you're developing like predefined motor patterns and learning skill too. Mm-hmm. So you're not just relying on your joint flexibility, but rather you're starting to learn this is how this movement should feel in space, so then you can get feedback quicker. Yep. So if you're a downhill skier and you're able to develop better range of motion in a wide variety of positions under control and under load, then you're able to modify while you ski a whole lot easier rather than getting to the bottom of the hill and kind of bonking out, right?
Yep, absolutely. The variety of options for control increases dramatically as mobility increases. And there's a lot of factors for that are not worth talking about. You guys would probably get bored and stop listening. But I think it's pretty dope. And then Stacy has a whole bit in here about training your core, and the exercises that she lists, she has pictures, demonstrations how to do it: walking lunge, planks, side planks, single leg calf raise, single leg glute bridges. And those, and I believe the point is doing crunches is a type of core work, but it's not a good type of core work.
Kind of missing the ball there.
Missing the point. We need to train all the way around, all the way up and down. And that is going to help your injury risk, it's going to help your performance, and it's going to allow you to be consistent. Injury causes inconsistency in training. That's probably, for most injuries, probably the worst part of it, is now you can't train the way you need to for 4 to 6 weeks. And for most sports, that's a quarter to a half of the season. So preventing injury through strength training and good core strength, good stability, good mobility, it's just, the dividends on that are enormous.
Absolutely.
And then she does a fair amount on risk factors for the ACL, and I know you're dialed on this, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, so I think the ones that are specifically listed in the book are flat or arched feet because of the changes in ankle angle and how you can move, right?
Yep.
She talks about hypermobility or joint laxity.
Yep.
What some people might have called being like double jointed, you know?
Yeah, and the test she talks about for that is if you just put your forearm so it's vertical and then let your wrist go limp, grab your thumb and try to touch your thumb to your arm. If you can, you're hypermobile. I can if I really work at it, but I'm definitely not hypermobile.
Not even close.
For somebody that's hypermobile, it'll just like easily touch.
Mm-hmm. She also talks about, once again, that quad dominant movement pattern or weaker hips and posterior chain as being a risk factor.
What she talks about there is there's a bunch of really dialed tests you can get if you go to a professional. One thing that you can do easily at home is just stand there and then jump as high as you can and note, what do you feel doing the most work? If you feel your quads doing the bulk of the work, that's quad dominant, not great. If you feel like your hips, your glutes, and your whole leg is involved, that's better.
Absolutely. She talks about a weak core being a risk factor. We've kind of already touched on that.
I think so.
And then lastly, she talks about a leg imbalance or asymmetry between the two. being a big risk factor. And that's something I've seen a ton in with team sport,
Yeah.
especially women's soccer as being the highest prevalence there, just because of the nature of how they move and play, right?
Yeah.
Or what side of the field they play on can predispose them to that. And then the last thing, which is just an add-on for me, is that depending on your lifestyle, activity level, and training type, neural fatigue is a huge risk factor.
Oh, yeah.
So if you are skiing every single day and you're trying to ski as hard as possible, that fatigue will build up over time, and that puts you at a huge risk.
Yeah, and I've got an example from 2 or 3 years ago. This is from a dude, but Jay, really strong, had him on a really good training program, and then we just kept getting snow, and he skied 29 days in a row. Towards the end of the 29th day, he was on an easy hill. He was just making a turn, and his knee just blew, and he fractured his tibia and tore his ACL, sprained his MCL, and nothing happened. It was just his body saying, dude, cut it out.
Mm-hmm.
And due to women's anatomy and hormones, it's easier for that to happen to a woman. So yeah, neural fatigue is enormous. Recovery is so important, and that's where 15 grams of protein before, 30 grams of protein after. That helps a lot. On the leg dominance, one leg being more dialed than the other, Stacy has an example, a test. So you can draw a square, stand in the middle of it, jump forward, back to the middle, jump backwards, back to the middle, jump left, back to the middle, jump right, back to the middle, and count the number of times you hit the middle. Do that on your right leg for 30 seconds, and then do that, take a rest, and then do it on your left leg for 30 seconds. And if the numbers are significantly different, so I'd say more than 5% different, probably it would be a good test. You need to work on that.
Yeah, typically what I've found in the research, which is more like from using force plate tests and stuff like that, is the threshold is somewhere around 8%.
Okay.
But everybody has some asymmetry. None of us are walking around here perfectly 50-50.
Yeah.
So it is normal to have a difference between the limbs,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to determine, is that difference going to put you at a risk based on what you're doing?
Yeah.
And how great is that difference? So I think it's a really good test that she lists.
Yeah. And just to further on symmetry isn't real, is if we were to cut you perfectly in half from head to toe, right down your nose line, down your belly button, and then opened you up, your insides are not symmetrical. You got more liver on one side, more lung on the other, more heart on one side, and just the list goes on and on. So symmetry is good to be aware of. You're never going to be symmetrical. So don't chase it. Like, oh, I can't do my sport because my right hip is stronger than my left hip, or that's all nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
If it's 80% different, yeah, probably sit out and work on it a little bit. But if they're kind of in the region, you just want to be aware of where that is, and then if you change from that, is worth looking at. And then with the foot thing, so flat feet, high arches, you can train your feet. So intrinsic musculature of the feet or the foot is a really important thing, and there are a lot of good ways to train that. You can Google intrinsic musculature of the foot, exercises to do, so you can do like the towel pulls,
Mm-hmm.
learn to move just your big toe, learn to move just your little toes, learn to pick up your little toes and then spread your feet out, bring it down. Doing ankle spring positions, that's really helpful. So if you Google ankle spring position 1, 2, 3, 4, there are tons of really good videos on how to do that. That can all help with the foot, doing the foot's job better. So the problem with a flat foot or too high of an arch in a foot is the way the foot is engineered is there's a large transfer of energy, and it kind of acts like a spring. And if you're flat, you don't really have a spring anymore. And if you're too high, your spring doesn't work very good. And then instead of absorbing and releasing that load through sport, the load goes up chain, and that's where it can become a problem for the knees, which is interesting. And then this is specifically for women. Heels aren't great. Just don't.
Yep.
If you're going to a wedding or you're going to a black tie event or you're doing something fancy like once a month and you want to wear heels, sick, get after it. If you wear heels daily for work, you are putting yourself in a position where you're more likely to get an ankle and knee ligament injury, low back issues, because it's tipping you forward, so you have to arch your back more to stay balanced. It shortens the heel cord, so your Achilles gets shorter, and there's problems with that. It actually does a lot of stuff that's not super good. And then like your chance of bunions skyrockets, your chance of neuroma skyrockets. I've had one of those. They're not great.
No.
It requires surgery to get better if it gets bad enough. So just wear heels on special occasions if you have to, but stop wearing them daily.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. But basically, strength train, and you'll do a lot better.